Chapter 1. Trump, Zelensky, and the compensation debate. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Inside the White House, advisors leaned in, eyes watched, hands rested on polished wooden tables. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Donald Trump sat at the head of the room. His voice broke the silence. I can end this war in one day. A bold claim, a dangerous promise. Some believed him. Others were skeptical. The war in Ukraine had dragged on for too long. Too many lives lost. Too much destruction. Now, Trump had a plan. But what was it? And more importantly, would it work? Meanwhile, across the ocean, Volodymyr Zelensky listened. The Ukrainian president had fought hard for his country. He had stood in the ruins of his cities. He had begged the world for support. He had shaken hands with leaders. Some had helped. Others had turned away. Now, he faced a new decision. Would he trust Trump? The deal sounded simple, at least on the surface. Trump wanted Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. He believed a solution was possible. No more weapons, no more fighting, no more war. But Zelensky had doubts. How could he trust Russia? How could he sit at a table with the man who had sent missiles into Kyiv? Trump's offer was not just about peace. It was about power, about influence, about America's role in the world. His supporters saw him as a deal maker, a man who could solve problems, a leader who could do what others had failed to do. His critics saw something else. A man willing to gamble with Ukraine's future. As the news spread, reactions were mixed. Some called it brilliant. Others called it reckless. European leaders whispered in back rooms. Would they support Trump's idea? Or would they stand with Zelensky? In Moscow, Putin listened too. He smiled. He knew the war had divided the West. Now, that division was growing. In Kyiv, Zelensky had to decide. Would he accept the deal? Would he risk peace talks with a country that had bombed his people? Some advisors urged caution. Others saw opportunity. One thing was clear. Whatever he chose, history would remember. Behind closed doors, the debate continued. One man said yes, another said no. Voices rose, arguments clashed. Trump leaned back in his chair, watching. He was used to making deals. He knew how to pressure, how to push, how to win. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. Zelensky hesitated. He had fought too hard to give up now. His country had suffered. His people had died. A bad deal could mean losing everything, but rejecting it could mean more war, more destruction, more pain. Outside, the world waited. The cameras flashed. The reporters whispered. Would Trump's plan save Ukraine or divide the world even further? And as the clock ticked, one question remained. What would Zelensky do? Chapter 2. The War That Changed Everything. It began in the early hours of the morning. Darkness covered the cities of Ukraine. Then, the first explosions shook the ground. Sirens wailed. People ran. Some hid in basements. Others tried to escape. No one believed it at first. But the truth was clear. Russia had invaded. The world watched in shock. Leaders spoke in urgent tones. Some called for peace, others called for action. In Washington, in Brussels, in London, meetings were held. What should they do? Stand with Ukraine or stay out of the fight? The decision was not easy. War had come to Europe, and this war would change everything. In Kiev, President Zelensky refused to leave. He stood in the streets, surrounded by his people. "I am here," he said. His words spread across the world. In that moment, he became more than a leader. He became a symbol, a man who would not run, a man who would fight. The Russian army moved fast. They thought Ukraine would fall in days, but the people resisted. They fought back. Ordinary men and women picked up weapons. Farmers blocked roads. Teachers, doctors, engineers. They all stood together. Ukraine would not surrender. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin watched. His plan was not working. The West was reacting. Sanctions, weapons, support. He had expected division. Instead, NATO grew stronger. Countries that once stayed neutral now took a stand. Germany, once hesitant, sent arms. Finland and Sweden, once outside NATO, now wanted to join. The war was no longer just about Ukraine. It was about power, about alliances, about the future. The world was shifting. Old friendships were tested. New ones were made. China watched closely. Would they support Russia or stay out of the fight? No one knew for sure. The battlefield changed every day. Cities were destroyed. Families were torn apart. Soldiers on both sides lost their lives. The cost was high. And still, no end was in sight. Would there be peace, or would the war drag on for years? Meanwhile, the energy crisis worsened. Russia cut gas supplies to Europe. Prices soared. Factories shut down. People worried about winter. Would they have enough heat? Would the lights stay on? The war was not just about land. It was about survival. As months passed, Ukraine gained strength. With Western weapons, they pushed back. Kherson, Kharkiv, Bakhmut. City by city, they fought to take back their home. Each victory brought hope. But the danger was not over. Putin had another weapon. A threat darker than bombs. The world feared nuclear war. Tension grew. Diplomats met behind closed doors. Secret calls were made. Messages were sent. Could there be a deal? Could the fighting stop? No one knew. Every move was risky. One mistake could mean disaster. And still, Ukraine stood strong. The people refused to give up. They rebuilt what was destroyed. They mourned their losses, but they never lost hope. This war had changed them. It had changed the world. And as the days passed, one question remained. How would it end? Chapter 3. The European Union's response. Is Europe truly united on Ukraine, or is there internal division? The room was full, but the silence was heavy. Inside the European Parliament, leaders sat around a long table. Some leaned forward, listening. Others whispered to their advisers. Maps, reports, and documents lay scattered before them. The war in Ukraine had changed everything. It was no longer just a distant conflict. It was now their crisis, too. The decision seemed simple. Help Ukraine. But nothing in politics was ever simple. Some countries wanted to act fast. They spoke of more weapons, more aid, more sanctions. Others hesitated. They worried about Russia's next move. They feared economic collapse, energy shortages, even war spreading beyond Ukraine's borders. The question hung in the air. How much were they willing to risk? Germany hesitated. Their economy relied on Russian gas. Sanctions meant higher prices, closed factories, cold homes. Could they survive without Russian energy? France pushed for diplomacy. We must talk, Macron said. There is still a path to peace. But Poland and the Baltic states had no patience. They had lived under Russian rule before. They knew the cost of waiting. Ukraine needs more, they said, and they need it now. Outside, protests filled the streets. People carried blue and yellow flags. Their voices echoed through Brussels. Help Ukraine! Stop Russia! They wanted action, not debates, but inside the conference halls, leaders struggled to agree. The cracks were showing. Sanctions had begun. Russian banks were frozen. Businesses were cut off. Planes could not fly over European airspace. The ruble fell. Factories in Moscow shut down. But was it enough? Some said yes. Others argued Russia would find a way. Sanctions take time, economists warned. But time was running out. Bombs were still falling. Weapons became the next battle. Tanks, missiles, ammunition. Should Europe send more? Some said yes. They believed Ukraine could win. Others feared escalation. If we push too hard, they warned, Putin might push back. The word hung in the air like a shadow. Nuclear. No one wanted to say it, but everyone was thinking it. Winter arrived. The energy crisis deepened. Gas prices soared. People worried about heating their homes. Governments scrambled for solutions. Norway increased gas supplies. The Netherlands reopened coal plants. But it was not enough. Russia had turned off the taps. Europe felt the cold and the pressure. Would they stand firm, or would they break? Zelensky spoke again. Another video call, another plea. He stood in his bunker, eyes heavy but determined. We fight for you, he said, but we cannot do it alone. His words moved some to action. More weapons arrived. More sanctions were approved, but not everyone agreed. Hungary resisted. Orban shook his head. We must protect our interests. A small voice, but a dangerous one. In Moscow, Putin watched. He saw the divisions. He saw the hesitation. He smiled. The longer the war lasted, the weaker Europe became. That was his strategy, his gamble. And in some ways, it was working. Months passed. The front lines shifted. Cities fell. Cities were retaken. The war dragged on. And still, Europe debated. Would they send fighter jets? Would they freeze Russian assets? Would they let Ukraine join the EU? Every decision took time. Too much time. And war does not wait. The world watched. The United States sent more weapons. China remained silent. The Gulf nations played both sides. But Europe? Europe was torn between its past and its future. They wanted peace, but they feared the price of war. As the meetings continued, one thing became clear. This was not just about Ukraine. It was about the future of Europe itself. Would it stand together? Or would it fall apart under the weight of fear, politics, and self-interest? The war had changed everything, and the cracks were only getting deeper. Chapter 4. The Arab Gulf Steps. In how did Saudi Arabia and others become key players? The war had shaken the world. For months, nations chose sides. The West stood with Ukraine. Russia stood alone, or so it seemed. But in the shadows, other players were moving. The Arab Gulf had watched from afar. Now, they were stepping in. A private jet landed in Riyadh. The lights of the Saudi capital shone in the night. Inside a quiet room, men in suits spoke in hushed voices. No cameras, no journalists, just power, pure and silent. A decision had to be made. Would the Gulf nations help Ukraine? Would they challenge Russia? Or would they look after their own interests? For years, the world had depended on Gulf oil. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar controlled energy markets. When war began, prices soared. Europe needed gas. Russia had supplies, but so did the Gulf. And now, their decisions could shape the outcome of the war. A call came from Washington. The United States wanted the Gulf to increase oil production. It would weaken Russia's economy. It would help Europe survive the winter. But Saudi Arabia hesitated. More oil meant lower prices. And lower prices meant less profit. They had to think carefully. In Moscow, Putin watched. He had allies in the Middle East. He had sold weapons, signed trade deals, and built relationships. Would the Gulf turn against him, or would they stay neutral? He sent his own messages, reminding them of past agreements. His grip on power depended on oil, diplomacy, and fear. Qatar played another game. The small but wealthy nation had the world's largest gas reserves. Europe needed alternatives to Russian fuel. Qatar saw an opportunity. Secret talks began. Contracts were signed. Shipments were planned. The war had brought suffering, but for some, it also brought business. The UAE took a different path. Dubai remained a financial hub. Russian oligarchs moved their money there, escaping Western sanctions. Expensive yachts floated in the harbor. Luxury apartments were bought overnight. The war had closed doors for Russia, but the Gulf had left some open. Behind closed doors, Gulf leaders weighed their choices. Would they stand with the West? Would they support Ukraine? Would they risk angering Russia? Every decision had consequences. Every choice had a cost. Saudi Arabia made its move. The Crown Prince called for peace talks. A bold step, a diplomatic one. But was it real, or just a way to keep both sides happy? In Ukraine, Zelensky listened. Could the Gulf bring peace? Or was this another political game? Months passed. The war raged on. Money flowed. Oil prices shifted. New alliances formed. The Gulf had not chosen a side. But they had chosen power, and in the end, power always finds its place. The world kept watching. The war was far from over, but one thing was clear. The Arab Gulf was no longer just an observer. It was now part of the story, and its role was only beginning. Chapter 5. Putin's next move. Will Russia agree to a ceasefire or escalate the war? The room was dimly lit. Heavy curtains blocked the cold light from outside. Maps covered the long table. Red lines, black marks, arrows pointing in every direction. Vladimir Putin sat in his chair, fingers tapping against the polished wood. His expression was unreadable. His generals stood before him, silent, waiting for orders. The war had not gone as planned. It was supposed to be swift. It was supposed to be decisive. But Ukraine had resisted. The West had united. And now Russia faced a choice. A ceasefire? The thought made some of his advisers nervous. It would be seen as weakness. It would mean admitting that Ukraine had fought harder than expected. Some whispered that negotiations were necessary. The economy was suffering. Sanctions had closed doors. Weapons were running low. Even among his closest allies, there were doubts. But Putin did not like doubt. He turned to the map again. His army had taken land, but not enough. Cities had been bombed, but Ukraine still stood. The West had sent weapons, billions in aid, military support. But how far would they go? Would they fight directly? Would NATO step in? Or would they let Ukraine stand alone? A new strategy was needed. Some suggested a pause. Regroup, strengthen defenses. Others wanted escalation, a bigger attack, a reminder of Russia's strength. And then there was the unspoken fear, nuclear weapons. The word was never said too loudly. It hung in the air like smoke, dangerous and impossible to ignore. Would he use them? Would he go that far? The world held its breath. His advisers watched, waiting for his decision. Time was running out. The winter had slowed the fighting, but spring was coming. The next move had to be decisive, strong enough to shake the West, powerful enough to remind the world that Russia would not back down. In Kyiv, Zelensky prepared for anything. He knew Putin's mind could not be read. One day, there were hints of peace. The next, new missiles fell. Ukraine was fighting for survival. There was no room for mistakes. Soldiers held their ground. Civilians rebuilt what they could. The country refused to break. In Washington, in Brussels, in Berlin, leaders discussed their next steps. More weapons, more sanctions, a push for peace talks. Some feared escalation. Others believed Ukraine could win if given enough support. But no one could predict what Putin would do next. The Kremlin remained silent. No announcements, no public plans, just rumors. A speech was coming. A declaration, perhaps. What would he say? A retreat? A warning? Or something far worse? Then the message arrived. A new offensive was coming. The fighting was not over. The war would continue. No ceasefire, no negotiations. Russia was not done. The world braced itself. The next chapter of the war was about to begin, and once again, all eyes were on Putin. Chapter 6. The energy war, nuclear plants, oil deals, and global power struggles. Darkness spread across cities. In Kiev, apartment buildings stood silent. The hum of electricity was gone. Streets that once shone with golden lights were now cold and quiet. In the distance, sirens wailed. People lit candles, wrapped themselves in blankets, and waited. The power was out again. Missiles had struck Ukraine's energy grid. Substations exploded. Power lines fell. Engineers worked day and night, repairing what they could. But each time the lights came back on, another attack followed. It was a new kind of war. Not with tanks, not with soldiers, but with power and control. Russia held the switch. It controlled gas pipelines stretching from Siberia to Europe. For years, nations depended on this flow of energy. Factories ran on it. Homes were heated by it. Life depended on it. Now that control was a weapon. The Kremlin turned the valve, and gas stopped flowing. Winter was coming. In Germany, leaders gathered in emergency meetings. Would they have enough energy to last the cold months? Some feared a crisis. Others believed they could find a way. Coal plants reopened. Nuclear power, once questioned, became necessary again. But nothing was certain. Could Europe survive without Russian gas? New deals were made. The United States stepped in, sending tankers filled with liquid gas. Norway increased production. Qatar became a key supplier. Secret negotiations took place in Gulf capitals. Contracts were signed behind closed doors. Prices soared. Some countries paid any price to secure their energy supply. Others struggled. In Moscow, Putin watched. The West had imposed sanctions. His economy was bleeding, but he had one advantage: oil. Nations still needed it. Even as they condemned the war, they bought Russian crude, some openly, some in secret. Through hidden routes, through middlemen, through nations willing to look the other way, oil still flowed, and so did money. In Ukraine, the fight for energy was even more desperate. Nuclear power stations became battlegrounds. The Zaporizhzhia plant, Europe's largest, was now under Russian control. Soldiers patrolled its perimeter. Missiles flew dangerously close. One mistake could cause disaster. Radiation, explosion, a crisis worse than war. Would someone push too far? Western leaders warned of consequences. The UN called for restraint. But war does not listen to warnings. The battle for energy was just as dangerous as the battle on the ground. Each attack on Ukraine's grid sent new refugees fleeing. Each energy crisis in Europe tested alliances. Each sanction pushed Russia to find new buyers. Weeks passed. Months. The struggle continued. Engineers in Ukraine worked in freezing temperatures to repair power lines. European factories adapted, cutting energy use. Oil tankers moved across oceans, carrying fuel to whoever could afford it. The world was changing. Old partnerships were breaking. New ones were forming. The war had redrawn the map, not just of borders, but of power. And as winter deepened, one question remained. Who would turn the lights back on? Chapter 7. Behind the scenes, high-stakes diplomacy, secret meetings, urgent calls, and the battle for influence. A cold rain fell over New York. The United Nations building stood tall, its glass windows reflecting the stormy sky. Inside, diplomats walked quickly through long corridors. Some spoke in hushed voices. Others typed messages on their phones. The war in Ukraine had lasted too long. Too many lives lost. Too many cities destroyed. Something had to change. In a quiet room, a meeting was about to begin. The doors closed, the cameras were kept outside. No reporters, no public statements, just power, raw and unfiltered. Around the table, men and women sat with serious faces. Some wore suits, others military uniforms. Their countries were at war, but here they had to talk. A man from Washington cleared his throat. Ukraine needs more support. His voice was calm, but firm. Across from him, a Russian diplomat leaned back. He did not smile. He did not blink. More weapons will only make this worse. The room grew tense. Every word mattered. One wrong sentence could destroy everything. Thousands of miles away, another meeting took place. In Beijing, officials gathered behind closed doors. China had stayed quiet, but silence was not the same as inaction. Trade, weapons, resources, everything had a price. One deal could shift the balance of power. One decision could change the future of the war. Meanwhile, in Brussels, European leaders debated their next move. Some wanted to push harder against Russia. Others feared escalation. How much longer can we do this? One leader asked. As long as it takes, another answered. But was that true? Could they really stand together forever? Or would the cracks grow deeper? At the same time, in Kiev, President Zelensky prepared for another call. His days were filled with urgent messages, emergency meetings, and speeches to the world. His people were tired. His soldiers were still fighting. But he had no choice. Giving up was not an option. Midnight came. Another phone rang. An urgent call between Washington and Moscow. No one would ever know exactly what was said. But the conversation was long. The voices were serious. Was there a way out? Or was this war far from over? In the shadows, intelligence agencies worked. Spies exchanged information. Secret reports were sent to world leaders. What was Russia planning? Could Ukraine survive the next attack? Every answer led to more questions. Then a message arrived, a proposal, a ceasefire, a prisoner exchange, a new round of talks. No one trusted anyone. Yet the possibility was there. Hope, even if small, still existed. But peace was never simple. It required risks. It required trust. And trust was in short supply. Morning came. The meetings ended. The diplomats stepped outside. Their faces showed nothing. No victory, no defeat, just uncertainty. The war was still raging. But behind the scenes, in rooms without cameras, in conversations without records, history was being written. And as the sun rose, the world kept watching. Would diplomacy win? Or would war continue? Chapter 8. What's next for Ukraine? Is peace possible? Or will the war continue for years? The streets of Kyiv were no longer empty. People walked among buildings that had once been in ruins. Shops reopened. Children played in the parks. But the scars of war were everywhere. Windows were still shattered. Walls were marked with bullet holes. The city had survived, but it had changed. In the countryside, farmers returned to their fields. Some found craters where crops used to grow. Others discovered landmines hidden beneath the soil. The war had not just taken lives, it had stolen homes, dreams, and futures. Yet, despite everything, Ukraine stood strong. The question now was simple. What next? The battle was not over. At the front lines, soldiers remained alert, weapons in hand, eyes scanning the horizon. Russian forces still occupied parts of the east. New attacks could come at any time. The war had not ended. It had only shifted. Talks of peace continued. Some believed it was possible. Diplomats met in secret. Leaders made calls late into the night. Could there be an agreement? Could the fighting stop? In Moscow, Putin refused to back down. In Kyiv, Zelensky demanded justice. Both sides had lost too much. Neither wanted to surrender. Across Europe, the conversation changed. The war had tested alliances. Countries had sent weapons, money, and support. But how long could they keep going? Some wondered if it was time for negotiations. Others feared weakness. If Ukraine fell, would another country be next? NATO remained a key question. Ukraine wanted to join. It saw safety in numbers, but Russia had warned. This would mean escalation. More threats, more conflict. The world was watching. Would NATO open its doors? Or would it hesitate, fearing the cost? In Washington, decisions had to be made. The United States had sent billions in aid, but war is expensive. Elections were coming. Some politicians called for more support. Others wanted to step back. America first, they said. But what did that mean for Ukraine? China observed from a distance. It had remained neutral, but neutrality was not the same as inaction. Trade agreements shifted. Supply chains adapted. Every move was calculated. The war had changed Europe, but it had also reshaped the world. For ordinary Ukrainians, life moved forward. They rebuilt homes. They taught their children. They learned to live with uncertainty. Some families had been separated for months, even years. Fathers at war, mothers in different countries. Hope and fear walked side by side. Winter approached. The cold would test them again. Energy supplies were fragile. Russia still had control over key resources. Would there be blackouts? Would people freeze in the dark? The war was not only fought on battlefields. It was fought in homes, in hospitals, in everyday life. Ukraine's future was still unwritten. Would it emerge stronger? Would it stand alone or join new alliances? The war had changed its people. They had learned resilience. They had found courage, but the cost had been high. One thing was clear. Ukraine would not disappear. It would fight for its place in history. The road ahead was uncertain. The world was waiting. And as the days passed, one question remained. How would it all end? Chapter 9. The Final Decision. Who holds the power? One decision could change everything, but who will make it? The air was thick with tension. Behind closed doors, leaders sat in deep discussion. The room was silent, except for the occasional rustle of papers. Maps were spread across the table. Red circles marked the areas of conflict. Lines were drawn, erased and redrawn. The fate of a nation rested on these decisions. Every move had consequences. In Washington, officials debated their next steps. Some wanted to increase military support, others warned of escalation. How much longer can we do this? One voice asked. The response came quickly. As long as it takes. But how long was that? The war had drained resources, strained alliances, and tested patience. Would the West continue its support? Or was fatigue setting in? In Moscow, the pressure was growing. The economy suffered under sanctions. Soldiers were tired. Families demanded answers. The war was costly, not just in money, but in lives. Yet, retreat was not an option. Admitting defeat would mean weakness, and weakness was dangerous. Putin listened to his advisors, but his decision was his own. Would he push forward? Or was it time to negotiate? In Kiev, Zelensky stood firm. His people had suffered too much to surrender now. The streets were filled with stories of resilience, mothers rebuilding homes, children learning in underground classrooms, soldiers refusing to give up. The war had become personal. Ukraine was not just fighting for land, it was fighting for survival, for identity, for freedom. Would they accept a ceasefire? Or would they fight until victory? The battlefield remained unpredictable. Each day brought new developments. Some cities were reclaimed, others fell under attack. No one knew how long this could last. There were whispers of diplomacy. Could a deal be made? Could peace be reached? Negotiators met in secret. Proposals were exchanged, but trust was fragile. Too many promises had been broken. Too many lives had been lost. The world held its breath. In Europe, leaders watched closely. The war had reshaped the continent. Energy supplies had shifted. Economies had adapted. But war was a shadow that lingered. If Ukraine fell, who would be next? The European Union debated its role. Would it take stronger action, or would caution prevail? Meanwhile, China observed from a distance. It had played both sides carefully. Trade agreements remained open. Statements were measured. Would Beijing step in? Would it influence the outcome? The answer was uncertain. But one thing was clear. The balance of power was shifting. Then a message arrived. A new proposal, a ceasefire, a compromise. The details were unclear. Some called it a breakthrough. Others called it a trap. No one knew for sure. Yet, a decision had to be made. The world stood at a crossroads. A single choice could change history. Would the war continue, Or would leaders find a way out? The answer was still unknown, but the clock was ticking, and the next move could change everything.